Okay, I think we're live. So, welcome everyone to another edition of the Perception Action Journal Club. In this one, we might call it a book club, right? It's something I hope to do a bit more. What we want to do in this one is discuss we at least the first part of Tim Ingold's book. I don't know if that comes out. My green screen, blue screen probably messes up. Called The Perception of the Environment. We're going to talk about kind of generally, with an emphasis on how it applies to skill and coaching, and we'll let it go where it will the discussion. So before we get into that, I thought we'll go around and have some new person. So I thought I would let everybody introduce themselves again. David, welcome to the Journal Club. Can you tell us a little bit about you?
Thank you. Yeah, I am a cricket coach. I'm the head of cricket school in Edinburgh, in Scotland, and I've been coaching cricket since I've been 18, but professionally for about 10 years.
Okay, cool. And Marianne, how returning guest? What's new with Marianne?
Not much is new. So my name is Marianne Davies. My background's primarily adventure sports and a lot of that actually paddle sports, as well as mountaineering, mountain rescue, things like that, and equestrian sports. One of the early female coach developers in there, so which was really exciting. And I'm now doing a PhD with Keith Davids, looking at skill development in equestrian sports, so horse-human dyad and skill development. And I'm also a senior coach developer with UK Coaching.
Cool. And returning also Carl Woods. Carl, I mostly think of you as a theoretical person now, right? Do you have a particular sport that you associate with or work in?
Yeah, it's kind of how I've just evolved towards that direction, I guess, over the last few years. So yeah, I'm a senior research fellow in skill acquisition at Victoria University in Melbourne. But before that, I've kind of got a bit of a mix of applied and academic backgrounds. I was a skill acquisition scientist for an AFL, so Australian football team for a few years. And before that, I was a teaching research academic in a university in North Queensland. Yeah, kind of got a hybrid background, but I guess that's one of the very reasons of why I've been so drawn into Ingold's work, because I tend to just follow the inquiry as it opens up. It sounds a bit cliche given the book, but that's exactly what it is. And at the moment, the main line of inquiry that interests me is this kind of blend of ecological dynamics with some of these ideas in social anthropology and kind of just theorizing them at this stage anyway. So yeah, that's a bit about myself.
Yeah, they're actually surprisingly there's actually a footy league in Arizona that plays.
Yeah.
Arizona AFL, and there occasionally you see people playing cricket too in the park. So they're not super popular here, obviously, but yeah. So how I thought I would start with this is just ask people kind of their general impression of reading this book, and maybe a little bit about what you got out of it generally, and why you think, if you do agree that it's valuable for coaches or people interested in skill acquisition, which is the main people listening usually, why you feel it's valuable to listen dig into Ingold and read this. And I thought I would start with Carl, because I think we owe this Ingold introduction to Ingold from Carl. He's the one that kind of introduced it to me and the rest of us, I think. So and which I'm very happy about. I really enjoyed it. So Carl, kind of what general overview of this book, maybe?
Yeah, it's a big book, right? So there's lots of separate parts. I mean, set into 3 parts with lots of little chapters within it that kind of vary in length in themselves and kind of vary in different directions as they go. But I don't know. I stumbled on this book when I was doing some work a few years ago on elaborating on this notion of wayfinding, just to kind of help us better understand the I guess, what the learning process entails within an ecological dynamics framework. And that kind of then, following the lines, it led me into some of Ingold's papers, and then led me into some of his books, and this being one of them. And the first time I went through it, I kind of read it with a real kind of exploitation in mind, of wanting to find things that I could use to help me with that specific goal. And then over the last, it feels like a couple of years now, but over the last 18 odd months in lockdown, I've really given myself opportunities just to dwell through it and read it and note it intentionally. And there's the amount of things that kind of just resonate with me on different levels are really quite phenomenal. I think the reason it does is because Ingold himself seems to base his approach to anthropology in an ecological approach, right? So instantaneously, we're both kind of enmeshing together at the same kind of on the same roots of the same tree. But what it's really emphasised to me is that really straight off the bat, in the very first section of the very first chapter, elaborates on like cosmologies or worldviews, and it emphasises to me that it's these ideas that I guess we sharpen them within sport. Really extend beyond sport into so many other areas of our life, which can really help us subsequently kind of enrich our ideas in sport. So for me, I guess the biggest thing I took out of it was that, which is odd because I'm trained as a sports scientist, but I've got more things to say about skill, learning, and education that don't necessarily live in sport. Like that's something that I've found really quite odd for myself, is that when elaborating on these ideas or writing about these ideas, I actually have to find myself bringing them back to sport to continue to kind of place them for me. But they kind of are bigger than that. A lot of these ideas that he explores might at the start seem a little peculiar and a little different, but there's a lot of sections in there that emphasise things beyond what his intention is, which might be talking about how certain hunter-gatherer communities associate with their kind of the forest in which they dwell in. The way you read that can be exactly the same as how a football coach may dwell in the kind of environment that is their football club, and how they subsequently perceive interactions with each other, with other coaches and with players and other stakeholders. So yeah, in a roundabout way, I guess that the thing that I took out of this book and continue to take out of this book is that these ideas resonate beyond the world that you just inhabit of like sport, or for Ingold, anthropology. These ideas extend well into other areas of your life, whether, I guess, if you're a parent, a companion to a significant other, or even, have a pet in your life. These ideas can really help you kind of navigate your interaction with people and places and things on lots of different levels. So. I don't think I did it any justice, Rob, but yeah.
No. I think it's hard to pin down in one sentence. There's a lot to it. So, Marianne, what were kind of your first impressions?
Right. Again, like Carl, it's huge, isn't it? I love the difference between the way he talks about anthropology and evolution and mankind's position in the world compared to what I remember of my undergraduate evolutionary psychology classes. It's just like no comparison. And he's kind of going, but we are part of the environment. As a species, we are embedded within it. It's not hierarchy. We're not, we shouldn't be thinking about ourselves as being separate to nature, to our environment. And I think, like Carl said there, that really resonates with the way we can think about sports, that wider, as we do with an ecological approach, we think about the wider environments and those nested environments with which every sporting activity is part of. For me, unsurprisingly, for you, I found loads of it really fascinating, because my sports are things like adventure sports. It's about adventuring, going on big expeditions, paddling when you're on a river. you're part of the movement, the musicality of that river, of that environment. You're seeing the world from a completely different perspective. You're embedded in it in a completely different way. You can't just leave the environment. And so I found that really, really exciting and really interesting to read. Even things like when they were talking about the way the sort of hunter-gatherers, or I think it was in hunting actually, where they follow the pathways of the animals and just pick up things rather than going, I'm going to look in that space and then I'm going to look in that space. And that just set me all down remembering my search and rescue dog training and just how amazing that was, you know, learning to train a dog to air scent to find people who are lost in the mountains. And that's still a really incredible experience for me, because the first thing that the trainers taught me was that my job was to learn to pay attention to my dog, to pick up what my dog was experiencing, what it was telling me, how he was exploring his environment, and to support my dog becoming more attuned to what we wanted him to become attuned to, which was a live human scent, basically. And at the end of the day, my job was just to go, I want you to search this space. You know, I can't tell the dog how to hunt. I have no idea. So I loved all of that. That was, for me, there was so much in there that was really fascinating. Other bits of it that I found really interesting was this idea that skill is, you know, that sort of cultural differences are actually within a skill. And my childhood was very much moving around, because my father was in the forces and then he was a civil engineer. And again, I just thought about how different the places were that we went to. How, you know, sometimes I would thrive and I'd be top of the class, and then we'd move school and I would be in the remedial group again. And then we'd move again and I'd be top of the class again. You know, and I very quickly learned that actually places and people are so different, you know, and I needed to find somewhere that I could thrive in. And I think for me, from a coaching perspective, that made me really think about how important it is that we, again, when we're widening our understanding of inclusion and creating environments where we get much more representativeness from other groups of people within coaching, especially as coaches and coach educators and trainers and assessors, that you know, what are we seeing as skillfulness, and is that something that's cultural, or is it really about skill? And how do we make sure that we can look at that with a cleaner lens? I hope I'm making sense there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah, so yeah, very much. I just got lost for lots, and then lots again, probably from being a woman. This is my last bit, and I'll shut up.
No.
Really, I mean, and having horses and my stopping horses, I really pulled into that. You know, moving away from trust to domination. Mm-hmm. You know, and I've definitely, you know, I've left relationships because it's been very much about, you know, a domination, and I lose autonomy and agency. And I think about the way my horses have autonomy and agency and what they do, and my dog. Mm-hmm. And I probably, you know, people talk about how wonderfully well behaved they are, but I think if they watched the way they ended up like that, they think I was really lax, because it's very much co-created.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I like both of it. I think you know, the resonate is a great word for this book, and I think it's going to resonate with people depending on what your experiences are in a lot of different ways. I'll talk about mine for parenting. There's a lot of resonance beyond sport, but parenting. David, what are your impressions about the book?
Well, first of all, I have to admit, I haven't read the whole thing. We got about 70 pages into it, which okay. Which gave me a good start. Anyway, I would say that it's not for the guy who wants to coach the under-11s on a Wednesday night as the first book I'd recommend. It's quite it's not the easiest book to read, I would say, but it's very, very interesting, and it resonates a lot with some of the things that have already been said to me about the environment and all that, especially coming from cricket. There's a lot of environmental factors even if you just look at the difference in the pitches that you get in different parts of the world, and different even different areas within the same country can be very different, because it's a great art preparing cricket pitches. So and yet often, especially in the UK, we're training inside quite a lot of the year, so you're practicing in an environment which is very, very different from where you actually play. So that makes it a challenge, because you can't go outside when it's January and play cricket. It's just not going to happen. It's going to be dark, or it's going to be raining. So, and you're definitely not going to have any pitches, but you might have some AstroTurf that you can use. So there's definitely that's definitely something that resonated with me. The other thing that I would say about it was that the idea of trying to sort of dominate the environment, to overcome it. And I think there was a chapter about animals, and how animals have been domesticated, and how that's seen as an achievement, whereas really you can't. That's taking the human out of the environment if you're trying to sort of dominate it. And I think that's a lot of coaching. You see that happen as well. You create a technical model that looks great on paper, and you say, this is what we're all striving to achieve here, because this is what perfection looks like, and we're trying to sort of get control of this completely dynamic environment, which you can't get control of, because it's a two-way thing, and if you try and get control of it, you end up with something that looks good on paper but actually is not what's really happening.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the other big takeaway for me.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to think of it. For me, I think I was talking to Carl several years ago. I would not have gone near a book like this, right? In my work, I really was not interested in the philosophical side of ecological approach at all. I wanted to stay in my lane of perception action, and now I'm more open to it, and I think books like this really help. And a couple of things for me, I would say, reasons to want to read it. I think it stresses something we talked about in our last journal club, that the ecological approach is not just a set of methods. It's actually a philosophy. In this book, I think it helps to understand that if you go look at it in different domains and contexts, right? If you just look at it in sports, I think you get too narrow sometimes. And one of the things I really think you'll understand if you read this book is why it's called ecological psychology, right? I don't think people quite get that, and I didn't either. I think they can give a one line, because it's interaction in the performer and their environment, but there's way more to it than this. Then I think this book does a great job of that. So I think, like you were hinting at, Carl, I think he's obviously massively influenced by Gibson. And he explains Gibson in different ways, which helps you understand Gibson better. But then he also builds on it too, I think. So like he does what a great writer does, right? A great researcher builds on something that's already there, right? It doesn't start from nowhere. So I think that's really, really good. So in terms of specifics, I don't know where we want to start in terms of the chapters or anything. If there's anyone that wants to pull something out. One of the ones, the big thing that pulled for me from the first chapter was his discussion of showing versus telling as an educator, as a coach, as a parent. That was something that really highlighted that, I think everybody that just, that's the right way to teach someone something. Does anyone, was there anything particular want to talk about that, or anyone want to jump in about anything else kind of this? So we don't have to go chapter by chapter, but I just thought we'd start that way. Carl, I know you've been thinking about that, Carl.
I think that there was a part that I wanted to emphasize on, but I think we could get there a little bit later, and that was more on the dwelling perspective in an environment, and how certain societies just go off to be with a certain environment, as opposed to feeling like they're constantly trying to take something from it, which I thought was quite important. But your point on showing, there was I think it's around page 20, where Ingold talks about his father, like taking him for a walk to learn of different plants and fungi and these types of things through kind of directly interacting with them. And it takes me like that itself, like takes me to an interesting chat I had with Craig Morris a few weeks ago about this notion of like, if I was just to read that, right, with the training that I have, I'd probably read it from the lens of like, oh, geez, that's like, I'm not sure how that fits within an ecological framework, right? Like it seems a bit like, it seems pretty direct and you know, it's pretty pretty hands-on by his father. But then you start to understand the context in which it emerges and the way in which Ingold talks about it from an ecological perspective, that showing isn't, in that sense, showing from his father wasn't intended to be a showing towards this is a procedural way of doing, right? Showing was intended to kind of help him explore these things which perhaps otherwise may have been kind of cloaked to him. And that's why he's really explicit with his words that he uses within there. So things like, you know, if I could attend to things to which were so dear to him, meaning his father, then I would discover for myself much of the stuff that kind of he knows or already knew. So for me, it was this notion that you might show something to someone, but it's not to tell them that this is the start and end. You know, this is how you do it. This is how it's done. Off you go. It's more of a, and I look at it as someone that's a real advocate for trail running and hiking. It's almost like showing someone a trail and then saying, off you go and explore it. You know, go and see where it takes you. Go and interact with it as you can based upon your own action capabilities. And they'll have a different experience than what I will because they're self-exploring it. But that kind of self-discovery and self-exploration is still being guided by someone in that initial notion of showing, which is what his father did. So to show him wasn't this intentional, purposeful end to a something to know, but it was actually to show him a kind of a thread in which to follow on, right? And I think that's like you were saying before, Rob, that, you know, it actually helps you understand what ecological means in this sense. So to read that separate from the actual immersion of an ecological approach, you would be a bit, you probably would be excused for being a bit like, I'm not really sure how this fits. But then you start to understand the words in a little bit more detail, in which he's really explicitly chosen. And then you do start to realize that from that sense, showing is just a little bit more of a firmer way of guiding, or a little bit more of a firmer way of nudging, both of which, guiding and nudging, and in this sense, showing, aren't intended to be the means to the end. You know, it's not like, here, I'm showing you a way of doing, and this is just it. You know, nothing else. It's a form of helping someone kind of start a journey, or perhaps even orient themselves in a landscape or a region that they're perhaps somewhat unfamiliar with, which they can then go on to continue to explore themselves. And I guess the point that resonates with me through that is this notion of, like, he uses words like self-discovery. And I think sometimes we can confuse that within an ecological approach. And he does a pretty good job of showing us that it's not really self, so to speak, because self can be a bit like, it promote this like asymmetry, right? This separation. It's a single organism that's acting on an environment separate from everything else because it's self. It's coming from you. And he does a pretty good job at showing that it is self because you are, navigating these regions without someone telling you exactly where to go, but it's also not self because it's a relational interaction with an environment in a place, perhaps being guided or supported by an experienced other. So that, I guess, the difference that I see it is, that's why I like to use the word like active self-discovery. It's active in that it's an interaction between someone and something, and that thing could be someone else, or that thing could be a relational connection with an environment, which he does a really good job in later sections of the book showing that, certain hunter-gatherer societies view the environment that they're in a parental mode, in a parental worldview. You know, like children of the forest. I think he speaks about in his third chapter. where it's not just a phrase, for these different societies. It's actually a way that helps them take up with the environment that they're in. So just like, I would just enjoy hanging out with my mum. We mightn't say anything, but I just enjoy being in her company. They view the environment, these certain hunter-gatherer societies, these in this section, these children of the forest, view the forest in that exact same way. They'll just dwell within it because they want to be there with it. So they're establishing these deep relations, which goes back to your point, Marianne, on attentiveness. By doing that, you become attentive to features of it. So going back to what I said with like my mum, it would be that I would just sit with her for hours on end, and we might say things, we might not, but I start to attend to different features, her demeanor, her voice changes, her things that otherwise someone else may not be able to detect or attune to, and it's because I dwell within her presence, right? And that's the same construct that Ingold's working towards with these different societies. They dwell within landscapes, not to kind of exploit things from them, but to try to establish a deeper connection or relation, or I guess to adopt a more ecological phrase, they attune to the kind of rhythms of these environments to try to then understand it a little bit more, which then helps them self-discover or navigate these environments because they have a deeper relation with them. So circling back, I think this notion of kind of showing is an integral part of an ecological approach, but not because it leads to an end point per se, but that unveils or kind of, uncloaks a world that someone can then explore in their own accord by themselves. That's what really stood out to me. It's a short snippet, it's only a few sentences long, but it's a really, the amount of times I've read it and tended to pick out different things is really, really quite interesting. And it's inspired a paper that I'm working on at the moment with you, Rob, on this notion of like, it's the context that's important when we're trying to understand an ecological approach. You can't just take things out of it and think that's not an ecological approach. Well, it takes a different form of meaning based upon the context in which it's been put forth. So, that's what I took out of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good. And before we ask the other point, people, I wanted to emphasize the real important point there. I think, Carl, the word "self" in self-discovery and self-organization is really problematic for people understanding, because I think people think means I do it myself, i.e., it's controlled from the top by my brain. That's not what it means, right? And that's not what self-organization means at all. It's not you controlling, figuring out how to do it.
No, there's a really eloquent part later in the book that he kind of elaborates a little bit on that, in that it's self, right? But it's not self from that, exactly like what you were saying then. It's this notion that every time you head out, even if you're a really skilled I'll try to rope it into your world, Marianne. Even if you're a really skilled canoeist, excuse the kind of naivety of language, but even if you're a really skilled canoeist, every time you head out onto a stream, you have to submit to the dynamics of the stream, right? So it's not you acting on the stream in a way as much more as it's the stream acting on you. And the real skilled canoeist then isn't one that just rolls out some kind of established convention of how to do it. The real skilled canoeist is the one that's really attentive to the features or the dynamics of the stream, in which they then subsequently interact and respond to and resonate with. As they act on it, it acts back on them, vice versa. So as much as they might be by themselves canoeing, right, it is far from self organization or self exploration on the stream itself. It's actually this kind of relation that they are establishing with the environment. So based on that, every time they head out to paddle on the water, or every time, a footy player goes out to play a game, or every time, we simply walk out to get a coffee at the coffee shop, we actually we might be by ourselves, but we have to submit to the dynamics of the environment and kind of attune or respond to the features that emerge, which really attacks the heart. And Ingold does this a bit, attacks the heart of what skill is then, right? Which takes a completely different meaning when you start to view that learning becomes a process of attending to things, and it might be by yourself, but you are never by yourself. You know, it's these things emerge as a kind of symbiosis with a person or place embedded in a task, right? So it's an enmeshment of things. So I hijacked it again. Sorry, Rob.
Yeah, no problem. And I think that gets back to the control issues that David and Marianne were talking about this, right? We're not controlling the environment. That's a one-way street. It's interaction.
There's
David. Yeah, see you.
There's a good line in the in one of the chapters that I read that says the difference between is you pick up information and meaning, you don't pin on information and meaning. So I quite like that because it's quite easy. You can picture that, can't you? You can picture seeing what's there rather than applying what you know to what's there.
Yeah, no, I like that too. It's not, I think another phrase, it's not constructed, it's discovered. Right? It's there to be found, not in your head, right, in the environment.
Yeah.
Marianne, did you? Yeah.
It's
sorry.
Not, the other one I got is it's not enculturation, it's enskillment.
Yes,
like
that's a whole, we'll get into that. That's a big one, I think. Yeah. Marianne, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, just to build on a little bit of what Carl had said, I think what I picked up from there that was really nice was that he was talking about that education and the narratives and the storytelling and the songs, as well as the instruction being about giving cues. And those cues to me, it was like, this is educating attention. This is helping people to become perceptually attuned to information in their environment that then allows them to navigate that environment. And again, sort of thinking about things like, being on the water or mountaineering and things like that, those qualifications. And when you're out there, you don't know what you're going to find. All you can do is learn to read the environment. It's all, and I loved the bit where he was talking about the different sounds of the waves and the musicality and having a key. But for him, the key was like a music key, which I thought was lovely, because that then brings a whole load of information into being meaningful. And certainly if you think about sounds of water and and rhythms of nature and things like that, having a key that was like a music key for me was just really fascinating way of thinking about it. But again, it was like Carl said, this is all he describes it beautifully as a way of educating attention, as a way of supporting becoming attuned to perceptual information that allows you to then wayfare or to problem solve or whatever it is that you're trying to do in that environment.
Yeah, no, I think, and where it kind of resonated with me is, I think both parenting and coaching, you quickly learn you can only get so far telling, especially with kids, telling them what to do. The best you learn as a parent, the best thing you can do is put people in experiences and situations, right? So like, for example, I had a reason where if I tell my kids to try to make them feel grateful for what they have, it won't go very far. If I take them to do volunteering, so they get the experience just like his father, right? You educate your attention, see through other things. I'm not telling you, I'm giving you, pointing, nudging you a little bit and so on. So I really like those ideas too.
There's probably, like, I think this might be a nice opportunity to kind of, signpost some sport through this now. Like, I think because you can get pretty drawn into these like meta theoretical places when you read some of this work. And David, like you said, sometimes his writing, you can find yourself just following these really quirky threads. And I find it a good exercise when reading it is to try to link it back to sport and what it means, what it might mean in our world from that perspective, and from that, like, I think this notion of paying attention and attending to things is actually bigger than an athlete learning to attend to, or a canoeist, right, learning to attend to the rhythms of the water, or a footballer learning to attend to the movements of teammates. And I think there's a deeper importance here for coaches. And the area to elaborate on that, I think it's in this notion of like why certain hunter-gatherer societies just dwell within their environments, for no other reason just than wanting to be in it. And it's because they feel like they can, as I said, they can establish a deep relation with the environment and really learn of this really subtle changes in like wind properties or ground surface properties or colours of trees and these sorts of things. I think that back to some of the most experientially skillful coaches I've ever worked with, and they are coaches who can attend to things that not even tools that we use to quantify things with players can tell us. So I give you a case in point. Wellness questionnaires and these sorts of things are filled out regularly at high performance environments all over the world. And they're intended to, flag how players are feeling, which might, preempt that something might occur in their training loads. But some of the most experienced coaches I've ever worked with are able to actually attune to demeanours of players before we even get some kind of thing quantified for us. And that is because they explicitly spend time with the players beyond viewing them as athletes and commodities. They view them as things that they want to establish deep relations with and interactions with, in much the same way that, you would with a significant other in your life, a child or a companion or whatever it may be. And they have this kind of almost like you would feel like this, sixth sense of being able to feel what an athlete might need that they're working with or doesn't need, or how something's going on. I just have this, what they might refer to as like hunch. And that's what Ingold refers to from an in-skillment perspective. It's this kind of local know-how or this local knowledge where, an Inuit hunter might look outside and it might look like a clear day, but they mightn't go for a hunt on that particular day because they know a storm's coming in the arvo, and you look out and you think, how do you know that? And they may attune to some particular feature that we just can't detect, which helps them navigate their actions throughout the course of the day. Exactly the same way as how coaches I've worked with go, I just have a hunch about this player. We can't play them this week, or they need a rest this week, or no, they can go harder. No, I know they can go harder. And that doesn't come from a textbook. That doesn't come from a kind of a number that I get from some technological device. It comes from them actively dwelling and responsibly learning to attend to the teammates. The athletes that they support, in addition to teammates of younger players learning to attend to the movements of older players and demeanours of older players. So yeah, it might seem a bit different when you're reading it, thinking, how does someone going off and dwelling in a forest have any meaning to me as a coach? It has massive meaning, because the rationale for it is to help establish a rapport or an interaction with someone, which can absolutely be observed in lots of different sporting examples. So yeah, that was something that jumped out for me when linking it back to sport. It's more than just navigating problems for athletes. It's how coaches can really actively attend to the demeanours and features of players, which perhaps otherwise are non-quantifiable, which is why experiential knowledge and empirical knowledge is so important when we blend it, as opposed to one being hierarchical and more important than the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great point. Marianne, you have your...
I was just going to, I think a really good example for me of that was when I first had my son, and I was aware that I could sleep through a thunder and lightning storm. I could sleep through loads of stuff. And yet if my child's breathing changed, I was awake like that. I was so attuned to him that I was even aware of it in my sleep. And we become really attuned to certain things in our environment. And I think just for me, that really, it was an example that I think everybody can relate to and can understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
You can't learn that from reading.
No, okay. I can tune out every other kid's crying when I was in mine.
Everyone else's kid, and he just has pain.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So I just for me, that was a really a really good example.
Yeah. David, did you?
Yeah, just two things off the back of what Carl was saying that I thought of. Well, one is that it's not just the coaches, of course, that can attune to that. Other players, within this, within the same team, first of all, that's really important that they're starting to do that. I think it's very common that, especially with players that I work with, younger players, teenagers, they can be very self-focused and just think about what they're doing and not necessarily being aware of other people's states and behaviors as much as they could be. So that's definitely part of it. It's an interaction, not just coach to players, but between players as well. And I feel like that's something that the coach could be really good at sort of directing their attention to and helping with. Definitely a big part of it. I think often we, if you keep it in a coaching context, often we can step in a bit too quickly and solve all the problems for them and not realize that, they need a bit more time to attune to each other. And also to the opposition, obviously, if you're playing if you're playing a sport against somebody, then you are, if you can read them quickly, then you can get an advantage as well. So being able to do that is important. So that's one part of that. And then the other part of that is that that whole idea of attuning and that whole idea of interacting with the environment as a whole and not trying to control it is something that a lot of players will not instinctively like the idea of, because they want to have that control. They want to be able to master get world class at the basics, become achieve technical perfection, and the things that they feel it's going to help them. But if you're looking at it from an environmental perspective, that you almost have to go back and sort of break it right down and sell to them why they need to not necessarily do those things. And it's more about, like we said before, it's more about enskillment than, what's the word, enculturation. That was the word. So those are the two things. Sometimes it's not that idea of an environment is interrupted by people having different philosophical ideas, and you have to account for that.
Yeah, no, I think those are great points, David, and I think that's something he emphasizes really well. For some reason, we have this pull to not want to try to reduce the burden of engaging with our environment and being attentive. For some reason, I don't know where it comes from, but instead we want to become automatic and have things in our memory so we don't have to pay attention. That's kind of a lot of what the traditional view of skill seems to be. How can I not pay attention, right, to what's going on and do as little, right? So this is exactly the opposite of that, right? This is being fully engaged and attentive in a different way, I think, and that's an important point too.
Rob, do you think that's a cultural thing there? Because my experience is that I always struggled with that. I always struggled with the idea of moving away from the feeling of connectedness that I had with the stuff that I did, and then having to disassociate from it, which made no sense. And I'm sure, I know Kathy's listening to this, I'm sure she's the same. When you start to do that, when you're starting to try and control stuff as well, it's exhausting and it's really effortful. And then you start to actually lose connection really quickly, I think. And you've no longer got what I would describe as an honest and authentic relationship with the organisms, people or animals and environment that you're in. And yeah, I really struggled with that. And it was something I felt like I had to learn to do to get certain qualifications. And I got to a stage where I was like, no, I don't need to do that anymore. I just actually need to pay attention. And and it was so much easier. I say to people when I work with them, this might feel like it's really, messing with your head at the moment. But when you get the hang of it, you're going to go, oh, this makes so much sense. I can just concentrate. on being curious and attentive and asking questions and paying attention and becoming attuned to stuff, and not trying to remember all this stuff in my head that I'm supposed to be, you know, applying or imposing into my environment, or double guessing stuff that's happening, you know. So my perception is that it's a very Western cultural thing.
I agree. And
So we're connected.
Yeah. I think certain sports too emphasize it more. I think on the adventure sports, I'm a trail runner too, right? That sport really, you cannot, if you do not engage and intend to use the trail, you're going to be in the hospital in a minute, right? You can't not. So that for me is really eye-opening when I just started doing that. Carl, did you have a?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up as well that thread that Marianne laid out about this kind of that westernized view, and Ingold's like really really against that. You know, if you've read some of his work, and it doesn't take you long to get into the book to realise that he's pretty against this kind of empirical, hard scientific place that we dwell in. And in some of his other books, you know, he goes pretty far, and there's points where I'm like, yeah, I think I agree, but I'm not too sure yet. But then there are other parts that I absolutely agree with pushing back against that kind of westernized, and he argues really obviously for that kind of dualism between person and world and between mind and body. He argues really intentionally the other way, that there is no division and that they are a construct of a Western educational system that we put together. Whether you agree with it or not, it's a super interesting path to explore. But the point that I really liked on his arguments against that notion that really resonated with me is this notion is grounded in skillment, but this fundamental premise that to pay attention to things means to be to have to submit, which means having to be humble, which means realizing that you don't have all the answers, and that we don't have all the answers, and that no one has all the answers. Something I say quite a lot to some of my postgraduate students is, you know, I don't have all the answers. You don't have all the answers. And if anyone ever tries to sell you that they do have all the answers, be cautious of them, because no one does. And part of learning to pay attention to things is learning to kind of trying to break this notion of I know all the answers. Now I can't remember who I was chatting to. Might have been my partner Chloe about this the other day. She's a clinician that works with really at-risk clientele, and so we have these really interesting discussions about how she learns to attend to her the clients that she works with, some of these spinal cord injury clients, that in ways that you'd think, wow, like you wouldn't come across that in a clinical exercise physiology book. And the only reason she comes across these things is because she dwells in a place, in a task with these people. And what I think these approaches that preach this westernized view or this representational view really risk doing is sticking your blinkers on. So if I think I know all the answers to something, or I think I know all the routes on a set of trail runs, straight away I'm impoverishing myself by shutting things out of the environment. You know, I'm shutting things off that I don't want to attend to, because it's like, oh yeah, I've done that once. I did that once and it doesn't work, or I've gone that way and it's no good, or, you know, this is the right track to go on. This is the path that we need to go on. But an enskillment approach that Ingold paints a picture on is that, you know, these definitives of knowing things like roads that don't lead to a destination. You know, we are always, even in a really familiar terrain, we are always learning to attend to different features, and they always take different meaning as we interact with them, because our intentions change and because our own action capabilities change. You know, these things are dynamic. These interactions are dynamic. So to think that we we know the way all the time, or that we know the answers to these things, which is kind of the narrative he's pushing with this kind of westernized construct of education, that we're taught to think that the teacher at the front of the class knows all the answers, even the hierarchical design of classrooms, that they're standing up and that the students are sitting down. You know, this notion that he pushes heavily against really emphasizes that it's not a, you know, as an educator, so to speak, my job's not to instill idolized ways of doing that then all of a sudden you become enlightened. I'm taking you from naive to being enlightened, but it's to help you become attentive to things. And in me helping you become attentive to things, I have to become attentive to you, which means I have to submit to this humility of knowing that I don't know what you might do in certain situations, and having to respond to it as you go. So that really, as someone that is really inquisitive, that really resonated with me, because I like him, I really dislike the word expert as well, because I don't think it captures what it is. An expert isn't someone that has all the answers. They're just someone that's more attuned to an environment that they dwell in a lot of the time. And I think if we start to view our role as educators in that same lens, straight away we level the playing field that kind of this westernized society that he paints, at least, is trying to unlevel.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that is really important. And maybe taking a little bit different direction. And another point that Marianne, sorry.
I would like to add a little bit on the back of that. The other bit that I found interesting when he was talking about sort of Western science there particularly, and the idea that that's disconnected not only from the environment but also from sort of emotion and meaning, and that by doing that it then isn't representative of what it's supposed to be studying, because we engage due to meaning, and it's an emotional engagement. And yeah, so for me that was really important as well. You know, how do we, and I don't know what the answer is, but in science I know we're all trying to do things where we have authentic learners, and again I don't like the word learner, but we have authentic people who we work with who actually do those activities. They're not doing it for credit. There is an emotional, motivational connection already, and that hugely changes everything that we're doing from a research perspective. But yeah, that was the other thing that, you know, he was saying, we have this idea that we can look at it from this, you know, we can separate.
Yeah, I got that strong too, Marianne. This as a scientist, this idea you're supposed to be objective and distant and passive. And I think this connects nicely. A paper I did a video review of a few weeks ago, Uhara, their paper looking at Brazilian soccer, right? And the way their main research on that immersed right in and didn't try to be objective at all. They admitted they were involved in influencing it. And I think to really understand the context of things, I think we have to move in that direction. But it's very different than what we were taught as scientists, right?
And really hard, isn't it, to do that?
Yeah, it's very, very different methods, different things. And the other thing I liked about, for me, the discussion of culture, I think is important for a couple of reasons. One, I think in sports, we all recognize the culture we create as a coach is incredibly important in the social factors. I don't think we have a good way to talk about it a lot of times. Team chemistry is another thing we kind of vaguely. I think this book gives some important insights into that. And the other thing I like about it is because ecological approach, kind of a misunderstanding about it is that it's locked in the present, right? All we can do is pick up information in here and now. But I think this book does. I don't know if he ever uses the word affordances, but I think he shows that affordances have a history based on the culture, and they're inherently about the future, right? So it's not true that we're just locked in the present. So I don't know if any thoughts on kind of how cultural influences and social influences are passed down. It's a very different view than the traditional view. I think we got into a little bit, but any thoughts on that?
I'll just lead off a little bit with that. One of the things that I found interesting was that he talked about, as well with other animals, not just us, that they obviously don't come with a narrative. So he was talking about horses, for example, and animals that we would have domesticated. We have an interaction with them, but our relationship comes with a cultural narrative, a history that we are aware of. And of course, the horse is interacting well, I mean, they seem smart enough, but I'm sure they're not having a conversation about that. So there's a difference in that interaction, but we don't recognize necessarily their lived experience and their agency in that interaction. But the bit that I found fascinating with him, when that is that he was talking about the fact that we actually, and not just humans, but animals are also changing that cultural environment. With, you know, that the way in which they interact isn't just genetics or learning from history, but it is something that dramatically, or can dramatically, change the present and the present future and the future. And that, I found that really fascinating, that, you know, that he talks a lot about how we tend not to be aware of that. We tend not to think about what's happening there within those groups and how powerful those interactions can be, and our impact on culture and change.
Yeah. So yeah, for me, that point is, you know, that affordances are not just about picking up material properties of the environment, like, that stand alone. Like his dad showing him the forest is a good example. His dad is shaping what he picks up, right? And just like a coach, the spacing between players, the way that gets picked up and used depends on the coach's emphasis on defense versus attacking, right? It shapes the social cultural constraints, shape the affordances. So it gives it this history that it's not just all about the information in the moment, right? So I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, and to pick up that part, like that's why he emphasizes as well that I'm with you. I don't think he uses the word. I actually, in my notes, I remember writing down this. He's alluding to affordances, but he's not using the word. That kind of pickup and that future pickup isn't something that's kind of passed down. You know, like it emerges in the present action of doing as well. You know, so that's where he pushes against this notion of enculturation, meaning that, you know, someone's born into a culture and they're destined to just be that person because it's transmitted into, you know, their DNA or their biology, right? And that's, he's pretty strong and goes pretty hard at that. But that the way of being emerges as they actively engage with experienced others in a context, in a task of doing, and that progressively changes over time, right? And that's how then this cultural formation occurs. It's not like one day someone's written down, this is our culture, and then every generation thereon in follows it. It's a process that progressively emerges as people are enmeshed or embedded in a context of doing, which consistently takes shape and consistently takes form as people go. And that's why he explicitly uses, as opposed to becoming human, you know, he uses human becoming. So it's, you know, this notion of becoming human means that you're not human to start with, and that you need to be encultured to become human. And that's the complete opposite to what he argues, is that we're already human, but we become by actively engaging with people that are already in dwelling in these environments or dwelling within these contexts. So yeah, it was a tricky, like a sticky-ish section to get your head around, I think, if you're somewhat unfamiliar with an ecological approach. And it's a section that I've read a few times. I think it's in, I've got my notes open here, so let me tell you exactly. It's in chapter 2 on the section that elaborates on enskillment and enculturation. So I would, if you're attacking the book, I'd give yourself some time to really elaborate and dwell on some of those ideas, because they do kind of, sometimes you do find yourself thinking, do I agree or do I disagree with that? But I think the general consensus when you come to the end of it, if you're someone that views the world ecologically, you start to realise that, yeah, that does make sense, is that, you know, culture isn't something that and I think we're fast in sport as well to show that it's like, this is their way of doing, this is their cultural identity, and we're fast to just dismissing it as culture, as something that, you know, what is it? But we need to, I think, sometimes appreciate that these things emerge as practical engagements in place with dwelling with other people, which some of Uhura's work in Brazilian football is a brilliant example in sport for those that are wanting an applied example. are some really lovely examples of what these ideas of inskillment as opposed to enculturation as a way of doing and learning are brought together. I'm happy to keep going.
I'm sorry, I muted myself. David, any other thoughts on any kind of the first few chapters or any on that that you wanted to pull out?
Well, maybe picking up a little bit on that idea of the way that culture works, and that word is, it's a complicated word, isn't it? But it was a discussion I was having earlier actually about how the influence of a new format of cricket on an old format of cricket, which is 2020, which is coming relatively recently into the world, and everybody imagined that it would be played in a certain way, very fast, much faster format of the game, played within 3 hours compared to the traditional test match, which lasted 5 days. Actually, it was a two-way thing. The more that 2020 cricket became popular, the more influence it had on test match cricket, and it wasn't what anybody predicted. Everybody said, oh, it's going to be like this. Everybody knows that it's going to be the death of the spinner, and it's going to be everybody's just going to try and smash every ball out the ground for six, and that's all it's going to be. It's just going to be a bit of a hit and a giggle, and that'll be that. But actually, it turned into an incredibly nuanced game, which has very strongly influenced all the other formats of the game. So it's to me that show is a good example of how that it's kind of like a two-way thing that's happening there, rather than just we take all the traditions that we've had in one format and put them into a new format, and we just do it in a slightly quicker, because it's a slightly quicker game. And actually, no, it's different enough now that people are saying, well, this is actually a different game now. It's not even really the same game. It's still basically got the same rules, but it's played so differently now that we're almost thinking of a different game. So that's how it's sort of
yeah, for sure. I in other sports I see that
how
too.
it takes on its own life rather than predict or get your hands around.
Yeah, you get these kind of unexpected outcomes. You can't predict how these things are going to influence.
The really nice part of that as well, David, I think, is that that progressive emergence has led to this, like, what you would call like a cultural shift in how kids play cricket, right? Because they're drawn to watching 2020 games, and they see people, here in Australia, like David Warner playing these games and hitting these crazy shots, and then they go off and interact with those themselves. They go and explore those themselves, and then you see this progressive change in the way that bats are made, so that bats are thicker and have firmer edges, so that the ball can go further when they hit them. And so this whole process is this enmeshment in doing, though, right? It's not a manual that someone's passed down. It's these things emerge as people go about actively engaging with a task in an environment. There was a part that jumped out at me as well, like based on that, and you. I think maybe you, Marianne, or maybe Rob said it at the start, where you mentioned there was a section in here where he talks about storytelling and the importance of storytelling, and that was a really that kind of like pricked my ears a little bit when I came across that section, because traditionally, like, storytelling's viewed as it's viewed in a representational way, right? Where it's like, I'm telling you a story so you can construct something in your mind, and then you can go off and enact it. And he paints a really beautiful picture of it being not that. And this, to me, is why worldviews are so important, and centralizing your views and having a philosophical roots of the tree, because it's how you then interpret how a story is used. And I think you shared it in a tweet, Rob, recently, where he spoke about stories being not as things that enable you to build a representation, that they're things that help you are drawn into a world to start to pay attention more to it. And there's a beautiful excerpt from an ethnography of Indigenous Australians, where storytelling is like an integral part of being, when they are unfamiliar with a certain terrain, they're with a different group of people. The people that are familiar with the terrain don't just tell them the story straight away to establish that to establish a representation. They actually take them out and walk with them through the landscape first, and then they come back and then they tell a story as a way of then helping further uncloak, the features of the environment that they've subsequently been exposed to. And I hadn't come across a really eloquent way of talking about stories like that before. And then remembering, and this really interesting debate between memory and remembering. Remembering becomes a process that can't happen unless you're embedded in the context in which remembering is to occur, So it's a really, really interesting set of threads. I'll probably throw it maybe to you, Rob. Did you, it's probably moving into an area that you're quite skilled in. Did you want to elaborate a little bit on what that section on stories and representations may have meant to you?
Yeah, I think the other are storytelling and demonstration. Also, very different view of what they're for, right? Instead of building a knowledge base and a representation, it was more about guiding attention, giving people a map. Like I think we've talked about this comment, like almost like a map to explore, get you into your environment. I think that's kind of how I think about it. And again, not I think he does a good job. The music example you gave earlier on, Marianne, of things having kind of direct meaning instead of having the example. I can't remember how he phrased it, but yelling is not representing being anger. It is anger, right? Something like that. So it's the same kind of thing with stories. They're not meant to represent or code something in some abstract metaphor. There are, so I think I kind of like that too, that section too. Yeah. Marianne, do you?
Yeah, I just hopefully this will make sense. I keep people come back again and again with the argument against an ecological approach that you can't teach someone to tie a knot, in an ecological way, or there are certain things that you have to just be very prescriptive and I teach people to tie knots with stories. They usually have things like rabbit ears and lots of Mickey Mouse ears in the stories. They make loops and bites and things like that in the rope. And those narratives allow people, again, emotionally connect with something, to be able to recognize an affordance or recognize and understand patterns that are meaningful and being able to check things. And one of the reasons why I do that is because it's way more effective than just giving instructions. So yeah, I agree. There's stories, things like stories and musicality, and are really about helping people, guiding them to a search space that helps them to pick up information or become attuned to information that will allow them to become more skillful, or to navigate whatever it is that they're exploring. And that's very different from a representation. Totally different.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that point as well. Again, trying to signpost it within sport. What storytelling might mean in sport. You did a great job just then, Marianne. Exactly that. I'm really fortunate as well. I do a fair bit of work with James Rudd, who's a physical. He primarily focuses his work ecologically on physical education and physical activity and unpacking what some of these mean. And I regularly find myself reading some examples on papers that we write together on how he discusses how physical educators can use stories to help children engage in environments in really different ways, which I think is a really rich, rather than telling them, you have to roll under this log, it can be a story like, okay, which goes into what Ingold talks a little bit about later in the book about, hunter-gatherer societies that see themselves through kind of animalistic lenses, So instead of, you have to roll under this log, it's like, okay, well, you're a snake now, and this in this particular environment, right? This snake hates getting wet, so you can't fall off into the water because you don't want to get wet. This snake doesn't like getting wet. So off you go, but you have to get across the river, you know, and there's only a couple of little paths for you to do that. They haven't built a representation in their mind, right? What you've done is you've opened them into a world, and you've drawn them into a world of exploration of which they can navigate regions, they can perceive affordances, and they can realise those affordances that perhaps otherwise wouldn't have been perceptible for them. You know, they wouldn't have been able to place those things. And by telling them this is how you roll, or this is how you slither, or this is how you move over the river, you've actually shut those opportunities for exploration off, and you've kind of impoverished their environment by taking those opportunities away from them to do so. So yeah, that section on storytelling again is another one that I dwelled on a bit for that reason, that I thought, you know, in high performance sport, I'm sure I can't come up with something now, but I'm sure there's a place for it. But really what resonated for me was its situation in physical education in class, where historically it's taught from, you know, this is how you hit a tennis ball, follow these steps, or this is how you jump, or this is how you do a sit-up, or these are these things that are historically taught in physical education. Storytelling is a way of completely pushing away from that and enriching the child's environment by enabling them to explore and perceive affordances that may otherwise have been meaningless to them. So, and there's another point that you said there, Rob, on yelling isn't like a code for being angry, it's being angry. And that resonated with me from physical education, from this other point, that whenever I walk past a school or a playground or something, it's really loud. And then you often think with traditional classroom settings in PE, the teacher wants it quiet so their voice can be heard, right? So they're by telling the kids to be quiet, it's actually taking away that jovial noise and loudness, which is physical activity. I've thought on this idea for a long time. It would be really cool to compare approaches, you know, like a traditional textbook pedagogical approach to physical education, and actually have like sonification sensors, have sound that you capture, and you contrast the sound to a non-linear pedagogical approach, which is more engaged or immersed in tasks, and compare the sounds. I think kids in the non-linear approach would be so much louder, and it's because the loudness is the activity. It's not a code or a representation of the activity. The loudness is the activity. So by telling the kids to be quiet, you're actually, you know, taking away the opportunity to be physically active. So yeah, a quirky one that I picked up out of that, but I enjoyed that part too.
Yeah, I always listen when I go to do if I'm doing a coach development session or an assessment. I sit and listen for exactly that. What's the noise, the pitch, the tone, the musicality of that session, you know, and if it's quiet or if it's just the coach talking, I'm already like, what's going on here? Because you're right, it's just like, what is, you know, like you can just pick up so much from what that background noise is.
That talks to an interesting point too. Like I know he's heavily influenced by Gibson, and that brings up another cool point, that perceiving the environment isn't just visual, right? Like it's an embodied sensory way of being, you know. So that could be hearing, and then there's a section later in the book that he talks about seeing with the ears and hearing with the eyes. And there's a really cool example that he talks about bird watchers, and bird watchers listen to the birds off somewhere, and then that's what directs their visual search. So it's not just this notion of perceiving the environment visually, it's this entire immersement of this sense of, and that's why he often uses phrases like seeing, hearing and feeling. That's how we perceive our environment, and no sensory system is better than another one. You know, it's not the eyes are more important than the ears, which are more important than the tactile senses. It's that they all work together, enmeshed together. And that's why he says, yeah, I see with my ears and I hear with my eyes. And to me, that's spot on. You know, like I think about a cricket umpire, David, in your space, when they're standing at the end of the mark, and they don't see, and a batter plays a shot and misses it. They don't see the ball deviate, but they hear the nick that the ball goes past the bat to realise that the batter has actually hit it, so it is out. It's a prime example of again, this perception of our environment isn't just visually; it's an enmeshment of someone in a place, which is an embodiment of senses.
I've got a training example of that as well. There's a bat that you can buy which has got foam on it, which allows you to hit the ball a lot higher in the air for fielding practice, catching the ball and hitting it on the ground. But because it's foam, it makes a different sound compared to the wood bat. And I long had the theory that it affects the ability of players to pick up the ball more quickly, because they hear the sound. Part of being able to find out where the ball is, it's not only seeing it, but also hearing the sound of the bat on the ball. And if it hits the middle of the bat, it makes a different sound to if it hits the edge of the bat. So if you don't get that crack of the ball compared to when it's the foam, then it affects your ability to perceive where the ball is. So by training with that foam bat, you're training in a slightly different way to what you would have in a game situation. So that's a sort of a training example of that idea of the umpire hearing the ball rather than seeing the ball.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important point. I've done that, and I think I've told people in my batting virtual environment, people, especially tactile haptic information, people always complain about it even before I added it in, that it wasn't there. So it's a lot more than just vision. And I like the idea of meshing to get a little, one of the things that in ecological psychology, you'll hear us kind of rebel against is the idea of integration. Like the idea that the goal is to try to combine the information from the senses to come up with one percept, right? They're arrays of information. So I like the idea of a mesh is much better than integrating into a single percept. That's really not the goal of the senses in ecological approach. So we have a question, Matthew. I saw that, Marion. He's asking. I think it was asking about how Ingold's criticism of science, and I think this. I kind of think I understand this. So I can pull it up on the screen. Ingold, as scientific understanding is just one understanding, equal footing with other understandings. And for Matthew, I think if I understand your question correctly, the best example is the very first one he gives about, for me, in the very first chapter, he talks about why deer freeze when they're being chased, right? And he contrasts two very different explanations. One that feels better from a scientific perspective, that they're resting and and then they can get away quicker, versus the more cultural one that we don't kind of like as much, that they're giving themselves up to the environment, the people, the hunters. They're kind of somehow this connection and this intention Marianne was talking about. I think that's what. Do you have any thoughts on that, guys? Or?
Yeah. That example stood out to me quite a lot as well. That I guess that bodes the importance of context, right? And bodes the importance of appreciating the worldviews. Now, I do. Again, Matthew, I'm not sure if I'm getting your question right or leading off into a different area, but I did get the sense too throughout the book that he's like Ingold's anti-science, and he doesn't categorize himself as a scientist, as an anthropologist, and that is probably a point of contrast to me in that I do think I'm a scientist, but what science means to me isn't perhaps the picture of science that he paints in the book of what it is. Like he paints a really in other books he talks about it being like a hard science. He paints this picture that where a scientist is detached from the world and that they're kind of viewing the world and that they're trying to go in and extract something, exploit it and take it out and then study it, and then that's it. That's what it must have been. And what he calls for, I think, a little bit more as a softer science, where at least the scientist appreciates the experiential knowledge of the inhabitants of which they're studying, not of but with, They're not studying of them; they're studying with them, and that's why he's quite critical, I think, on ethnographies as well, being this like, I'll go in, I'll be a fly on the wall, removed, and just observe what everyone's doing. He's calling for more embeddedness of the inquirer within the inquiry to help provide a more balanced perspective of the thing of which that they're observing, or the phenomena that they're observing. So it's less deductive and what he calls a little bit later more abductive with regard to their scientific reasoning. And to me, like, that just calls, he refers to it as like soft science. To me, that just like screams for more transdisciplinarity, like more integration of experiential and empirical knowledge, that this scientific inquiry isn't the be all and end all, right? It's not the hard, fast rule, is that the way in which these local inhabitants perceive the environment is absolutely real to them. That's absolutely sensical to them. So to come in as a scientist and be really hard and say, oh, you guys are all like really wrong. This is the way, this is what you're actually observing. You're not observing a deer that gives itself up to you. You're just observing a deer that's kind of run out of capability to use, I don't know, this is going to test my physiology, what metabolites or something to they need to stop and have a breath. But to the hunter, it's absolutely not that. And you need to appreciate that to appreciate then the enmeshment of how they then manage the food or manage the deer once they've killed it, how they prepare it, how they respect it, which bodes into this broader notion of how they then subsequently perceive the environment. So yeah, I think the hard dichotomy that he points towards science and inhabitant knowledge is, to me, just calling for a greater entanglement or like what Rob said, enmeshment between inhabitant knowledge, which in sport is that of the coach or athletes or other stakeholders that are there on the ground, and the scientist, who shouldn't be someone that is like a fly on the wall or detached from the inquiry, but like with Uhera's work in Brazilian football, but is actually enmeshed in the inquiry itself, hence the transdisciplinarity. So yeah, I'm not sure, Matthew, if I've answered your question on that. So
that's kind of how I read it too, Carl. To me, the anti-science, I may be wrong, but I think it's meant to provoke people more than, like, he also has a go at kind of natural selection, and evolutionary psychology is kind of the one dualistic kind. He's good at pointing out the flaws with them. I think he's just trying to get people to think more broadly, like, with separating culture from science. And so yeah, it's as a scientist, it's a little unsatisfying at times, but I think he's just trying to provoke people to think, in my view, and it definitely does. To me, I was like, yeah, that doesn't make a lot of sense in some of them. But David, did you have a?
Yeah, just sort of the idea of putting science as the sort of the most advanced thing that we can do, and then anything else is, I think at one point he talked about how in early work it was anything that wasn't science was seen as savage, or something which is somehow less human, because it's not the peak, it's not the science which is the peak, and that's the only thing that we can do. And then everything else has no value because it's not as good as science, and we've moved on from that. And I think the point he's trying to make is that we haven't moved on from that, and that there is value in there is value in other things apart from science. So that's the way that I read it. It's not that all science is bad. Let's go back to nature. It was more like, just science is just one way of doing it, and it's no better or worse than any other way of doing it. We just need to look at things from different perspectives.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good way to put it, Dave. I think I see that. You see that almost in sports science too, that this experiential knowledge of coaching, like, we all recognize it's important, but it's like it's only validated once we can tie it to a empirical finding or some theory. Right before that, it's just nonsense. Right? Once we can, that's focus of attention effect. Right now it's validated, which is kind of a bad way to think about it, really. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a slightly different perception of that, only slightly. To me, it felt like he was highlighting the fact that the science maybe needs to be a bit more representative of what it's supposed to be studying, rather than that it's bad. Just that if it disassociates itself or it's disconnected either from the environment or from the motivation or from anything else, then we can't, then it loses the value in what it's not no longer actually exploring what it seeks out to explore.
Yeah, that both David and Marianne, those points like are spot on. I think like and I think he has written it intentionally to be a bit provocative. I also think within sport, like like what Rob, you were saying then with this notion of like we have to kind of fit it to things, which is that deductive reasoning. Like I enjoy the notion of sports science. Like I like to write papers and read papers that perhaps open more questions as opposed to answering them. And I think that's what he was suggesting a little bit too in some of these narratives, is that science is fixated upon definitives. But I view myself as a scientist that, it likes knowing answers to things, but not to have the book closed on them, but to perhaps, dwell in it for a bit and then use it to head off on some other path and follow some other line of inquiry that opens up. And I think that's that he's quite evocative with the words he uses at times too. Like that's the war, like he's waging on it, these types of things that, science is detached from reality, which bodes back to your point, Marianne, on it needing to be more representative of the context in which you're actually within. I think it did at times feel a bit uncomfortable reading it, being like, oh, geez, like I like what he's saying, but am I liking the fact that he's attacking me? Like I'm not sure. So, but yeah, I think it was rounding off back to this notion of a softer science, an embedded science, where we if we don't have an answer to something, that's okay. Like, and if we think we know the answer to something and it doesn't fit, that's not something to be shied away from. It's actually something to be embraced to progress on forward. So, which I think in sports science can be done better.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think that's a really important point. I think, as we were talking before, I think that's part of what the ecological approach is. It's not a set of answers, not a set of methods or set of things. It's an approach to take forward. So, I think I need to wrap it up soon. Does everyone, we go around the room, maybe a last thought about anything you want to talk about? David, did you want to?
I guess it was something that I wouldn't have started to read the book if you hadn't suggested it. But the more I read it, the more I got into it. So as sort of background reading and understanding things in a wider context, I think it's been really good. I'm definitely going to finish it off. But yeah, I was approaching it from a kind of almost from a practical thing, like how can I apply this? How can I apply this? And sometimes you that's good to do that as an exercise, but also just read it and enjoy it and then reflect on it afterwards. Perhaps would be a good piece of feedback for anyone who's thinking about delving into it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to put it. It's not a how-to book, definitely, right? It's to get you thinking. Marianne, did you have a final thought?
Yeah, I didn't get past chapter 5, and I'm still, that's just time. And I get into just reading it again and again and exploring stuff and going and looking at something else. So I would definitely recommend people to read the book. And I think the thing that stood out for me again is just that reminder of how important any individual's lived experiences, even when we're talking about the hunters and the story that they tell about why the animals would stop and look at them, that meaning is something that we can't just assume we understand. And agency and lived experience and that wider context is just so important and is such an important part of the whole ecological approach. And like you say, it's not a set of answers, because I think that an ecological approach is about allowing us to become attuned to information that allows us to wayfind while we're coaching or researching or whatever else it is that we're doing. Yeah.
No, I agree. That's a good way. Ecological approach to the ecological approach. I think it's, yeah, for sure. Carl, last thought.
Yeah, I'll pick up where David left off as well. Like I really like that point. You know, and I think I said it at the start as well about this notion that the first time I read it, I was like looking to exploit things from it. You know, like take things out of it. How does this live in sport? And then when I went through it again, a little bit more slowly and attentively, I really started to appreciate the sentiments that were emerging within it, and then the application to sport was just a natural progression from there on in. So yeah, I think it's if you're looking to if you're looking for a set of ways to be a better coach, so to speak, specifically for sport, it might be a grind at times. But I think if you're looking to genuinely explore some of these ideas in slightly different contexts and be open to them, it's a fantastic book because it really helps you navigate some of these topics, which what I think, after reading it, I've got way more questions that are applicable to sport than I did than I did beforehand. Admittedly, I really enjoy the way he writes and the things he writes on and the narratives that he writes. But I do. I think it's a read that you should really spend your time dwelling in, not feel like you got to rush through, and try to read it without it being a notion of what can I take out of it to do, as opposed to reading it from the lens of how does this support how I view the world, as opposed to the day job I have. I think so. Yeah. For me though, it's definitely a really fun set of threads to follow when you get to the other end, I think.
Yeah, no, I'd agree as well. And I my dreams, I wish I could write as well as he does. Some of his, you just want to frame some of his phrasing. It's beautiful writing. So yeah, I think I'd agree with all you said. You're right. It's more of kind of, like I said, a philosophical exploration of some of these ideas. And I think if you're interested in it, really, like education of attention, it really helps drive what that is home. There's so many great examples and that we talked a little bit about today. And we also there's one point where he talks about it almost uses a gardening metaphor for coaching, raising crop, which I think is a really wonderful. We didn't get to that, but then I'm looking forward. I think from what I've read a bit, it's going to get even more relevant, right, when we get in, especially the third section so we have two more of these. We have the dwelling, I think, is the next one, right, Carl? And then we're going to get into enskillment, which I think will be even more relevant. So thanks everyone for joining us in the comments and the questions, and we'll see you